and as everybody knows it, still concurrent programs are quite challenging in the sense that they're known to be hard to write because of different possible side effects, because of shared dependencies, because of memory models that can be quite complex. And they are unfortunately also hard to verify. So hard to verify because testing, for instance, that the formal method that is mostly used in industry has low coverage because errors can be corner case, and in general, if you want to do model checking on such programs, it turns out to be very expensive. So it's a rule of the thumb that everything is p-space complete. So we say, okay, we cannot do too much with concurrent programs, and still we want to support programmers, so to assist them with some ways to get informed about errors. So we want to be able to do error detection and possibly also error recovery. So we are interested in providing some automated way of building monitors that are able to detect unsafe states and controllers that are able to help to avoid to get into unsafe states. And actually, there are some programming languages that have built-in mechanism of supervision, like Scala, for instance. So you have actors that control other actors. So that's very nice. But still, it's something that is hard to do. And here comes synthesis into play. So synthesis is the idea that you want to transform properties into devices like monitors and controllers. Yeah? So you give a property, and then you want to produce by an algorithm some useful monitor or some control. Now, in this talk, I will first try to briefly recap what reactive synthesis is, and then I will go into three models of distributed reactive synthesis, which are the original model, Pneuly-Rosner, and then in a second step, I will show the Mazurkiewicz model and recap some results there. And I will finish with some new developments about log sharing systems. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt. I don't see the chat, so if there are any questions on the chat, you can tell this orally.
We'll track the chat.
Thanks. So synthesis is an old idea. So it's the famous problem of Church introduced in the 50s. So the idea is that you have a relation, so a specification that gives a binary relation between inputs and outputs. So let's say inputs over outputs over the alphabet of the binary alphabet. And what you want to do is to construct this device, C, which basically has to produce outputs according to the previous inputs. So it's a mapping from 0, 1 star to 0, 1. So it's a continuous mapping, in some sense. And it should be such that the relation between inputs and the outputs produced by C conforms to S. Okay, so you can imagine that inputs are coming from the environment, and the system, so the program, produces the outputs. So you look basically for such a device that continuously transforms inputs into outputs in a way that is consistent with the specifications. So this is called reactive synthesis because it's not just that you look for a model for this relation S, for this binary relation S, but you are basically constructing this device that according to some history of input bits needs to produce the next output bit. So it's reactive. So this was the original program of Church, and it turned out that it's very tightly related to games, between system and environment, to two-player games. So there are these two players, the system on one side, the environment on the other side, and the system needs to react continuously to inputs. And if you stick to specifications that are simple enough, like let's say omega regular, then you get what we know as omega regular two-player games. So omega regular two-player games, they were studied in particular by Büchi in the very beginning, but then by plenty of other people. So Büchi and Landweber looked at this in the 60s. And they offer a way to solve the problem of church by trying to synthesize strategies of the system player. So the system player has to have a strategy so that whatever the inputs from the environment would be, whatever the actions of the environment are, this strategy ensures that the system wins with respect to a given specification. So the problem turned out to be also fundamental in the area of tree languages. So you can translate these games or church problem into a problem about tree automata. So it's the famous MSO over trees of the infinite binary tree. And Rabin's theorem from 1972 offers another way to show that that we can construct effectively these devices C that transform inputs into outputs according to the specification. Good. Now, what about the distributed setting? So in the distributed setting, the story starts with a model due to Punelli and Rosner, who they just generalized Church's problem by saying, okay, we have an architecture of some nodes with communication channels. Some channels come from the environment, some channels are internal channels, and there are also output channels. And now, in their formulation of the problem, we are given specifications for each of these nodes. So here we have 3 nodes, and they give a specification as one for C1. This is a binary relation between inputs and outputs of C1, another one for C2, and a ternary relation for C3. And the problem they asked was to construct 3 devices, C1, C2, C3, in such a way that each of the devices conforms to its specification. So that's basically the formulation of distributed synthesis for Punelli and Rosner. Now, what can we say about this framework? Actually, it's quite disappointing. It can be quite disappointing because it turns out that synthesis for Punelli and Rosner is decidable only in very restricted cases. So basically, this architecture should be a pipeline. So there should be no fork. So this one, for instance, is undecidable. Moreover, in the case of the pipeline, the complexity is quite high, is tower n, actually tower n complete, where n is the length of the pipeline. So yeah, I've put here some references related to Punelli and Rosner's framework, but there are many of them. So in fact, the undecidability of synthesis outside the pipeline goes even back to a paper of Peterson and Reif about multiplayer alternation in 1979. So there are some related ideas appear. And then Madhusudan and Tyagarajan, they reconsidered this problem. And so in the original framework of Punelli and Rosner, the specifications are somewhat global. So they looked at local specifications and they characterized precisely which are the topologies that are undecidable. Hupfam and Vardi looked at rigs, for instance, so they try to extend. And Finkbeiner and Scherer, they introduced the idea of information fork. So in order to isolate exactly the point where undecidability comes in all these proofs. So since Punelli and Rosner, unfortunately, distributed synthesis has a very bad reputation. So when you talk to people about distributed synthesis, they say, oh, undecidable. End of the story, which is somewhat comprehensible because, I mean, pipeline is not very exciting as an architecture. So you have the feeling that it won't be very, very useful. Okay, but one can start to ask what are the reasons for undecidability, and maybe you will, as you will see, maybe we can slightly change the framework and slightly tune it in such a way that we get more interesting results. So, of course, it's obvious that undecidability is tightly related to the fact that processes, so these nodes have only partial knowledge about what happens in general, and there is no centralized control. So that's clear that, I mean, this lack of centralization is one of the reasons for undecidability. But can we say more on this? yes, we can say more, but now we should start to discuss other models, because distributed, I mean, as most of you know, I mean, everyone has his or her favorite definition of distributed, and there's no unique model, so there's no unique mechanism of cooperation. So what can we, what would be the models that could be interesting to look at? So just to recap the various criteria, so we can have synchronous or asynchronous models. We can have cooperation in form of communication or of rendezvous. And when we have cooperation, we can have also information exchange between agents or processes. And so what about Tonelli and Rosner? So Tonelli and Rosner's model is basically synchronous. So the semantics of the model is all the devices do some output synchronously. It's relying on communication, which is asymmetric. And more importantly, so the thing that smells bad here is that there is no information exchange between the processes. Yeah, so these controllers do not get opportunity to exchange messages, because they need to respect local specifications without adding anything beyond the specification. So it looks really like partial information games. So it's not a big surprise that the model is undecidable, and actually the undecidability proof is not very complicated either. I mean, there are some subtleties, but the primary undecidability proof was not very surprising. So let's try to tune a little bit on the model and look for something else. So first, so yeah, asynchronicity looks like a desirable property. And let's take something that is better behaved than communication. So we're looking here at rendezvous. Why is it better behaved? You will see. It's better behaved also because it's more symmetric than communication. But more importantly, let's admit the idea that we can go beyond the specifications and we can allow controllers to exchange information. So we can have some plus. When they do something, they can exchange information. And here we arrive in a setting that has a very rich history, which is the setting of Mazurkiewicz traces from 1977. And the Zielonka model. Okay, so let me go now over to the Mazurkiewicz setting and to see what we know there. So the underlying model is that of distributed automata. So these are Zielonka automata. So we work with finite state processes. So finite number of finite state processes. So proc is finite, and these processes, they share actions. So what is important here is that actions have domains and they are fixed beforehand. So the domain of actions is a subset of processes. And the semantics in this model is that when you execute when the processes in the domain of A execute action A, then they can do it subject to their local states. So only in some certain combination of states they are allowed to do it. And only those processes change their state. So there is exchange of information here implicitly, because executing a shared action is not just a rendezvous, but it's a rendezvous that is conditioned by the local states of the processes in the domain of action. So only certain combinations are allowed. So processes that execute the action know something about the other processes in the domain of A. And probably if you already heard about this model, so it's better known in terms of commutation of actions. So actions that have disjoint domains, they can commute, so they can be executed in either order. Yeah? Now, the big result and the nice part of this theory of Mazurkiewicz traces is this theorem due to Zielonka. That is one of the first distributed synthesis results that we know about. So it says that if you take any regular language that is commutation closed in terms of this domain, so this commutation rate to domains. So every such regular language can be turned into an equivalent deterministic distributed automaton. So this means that you can take a finite automaton for this regular language that is commutation closed. So there is a very simple condition that, that expresses that the language is commutation closed. And then you can construct an equivalent deterministic distributed automaton. So this result is by no means trivial. So it's, if you want to see, to understand it, actually it relies on, the main idea in the construction is to be able to work with a finite time stamping that allows to determine which actions are more recent. So from what a process sees in his causal path, what is the most recent information about other processes. So it's a bit like the happened before ordering of Lamport, but it's finite. So that the important thing is that you can work with this finite information. And the construction, the first construction has been reviewed in a series of papers. And so nowadays the most efficient construction is, so it's only polynomial in the size of a deterministic automaton for the regular language, but it's exponential in the number of processes. And it's actually also, there is also a conditional lower bound showing that we need this exponential in the number of processes. So under a certain technical condition, the construction is optimal. So we cannot do better than that. But that's not, I mean, that's not very surprising. You need, it seems that you need this finite time stamping. So maybe the only open question in this area is, can we show that we need this time stamping in the constructions, or is there any other possibility to come up with an alternative construction? Okay, so Zielonka's theorem, if you want, is a first example of construction of a distributed monitor. You give a property that is commutation closed, and then Zielonka's theorem allows you to construct a monitor. Now, what about synthesis? So to talk about synthesis, I will reformulate a bit synthesis in terms of control, because this is more convenient. So an equivalent way of considering synthesis is a framework introduced by Ramage and Wanham that they called control of discrete event systems. So it's a control setting. So in this control setting, you can put it like this. So you have given a system, which is often called a plant, it's an automaton, A, and it has two kinds of actions. So controllable actions, which are the actions of the system, and uncontrollable ones, the actions of the environment. So see it as inputs. Inputs were uncontrollable in Church's problem, and outputs were controllable. And you have given also a specification. And what you want to do is to compute a controller, C, so another automaton, in such a way that if you take the product of the system with the controller, then this product satisfies the specification under the restriction that the controller should not disallow any uncontrollable action. So you can only disallow controllable actions. So you can restrict the behavior of A, but only regarding controllable actions. So you can see the controller as a strategy in a game. Yeah? So it's just this. So it's the strategy, and you can so you restrict your controllable actions according to the history of the run of the execution that you have till then. The reactive synthesis and control are interreducible, so that's the same kind of problem, but control is a bit more flexible. So you can try to reason about controllers that are more sophisticated. You may have observable actions, non-observable ones. So you can vary a little bit more the problem. But it also turns out that this is a nice way to introduce distributed synthesis. It's a very natural way. So in the Zielonka model, what you simply say, okay, you have a plant, which is a Zielonka automaton, And again, you have controllable actions, which are system actions, uncontrollable actions, which are the environment actions, a specification. And then what you want to do is to compute another Zielonka automaton. So see, the only thing I did here is to replace automaton by Zielonka automaton, by a distributed device. And then we want that the product of A and C, of the plant and the controller, satisfies phi. And as before, the controller must allow all uncontrollable actions. So there's just this slight change that I replaced automaton by Zielonka automaton. And here we have the most natural formulation of distributed synthesis in the Zielonka model, in the Mazurkiewicz trace model. So this looks very simple, but one should mind that controllers here are local. So there's no centralized controller. Yeah, so this controller C is itself distributed. So this means that per process you have a controller. And then since the model of Zielonka automata allows some communication between processes when they do shared actions, this means that these controllers take decisions according not only to the past of the process where they run on, but according to the causal past. Because in Zielonka automata, so a process gets information, all the possible information from its causal past, not only from the local execution of that process. So one can rephrase this setting as distributed games with causal memory. So strategies use causal memory. So strategies are not just local to processes, but they use causal memory. And the big question is whether these distributed games with causal memory are decidable. So just to give you a small example where this could be interesting. So suppose we have a network where we have some nodes that may fail, and we may have also some connections that we cannot disable. So the point would be here that we want to transfer information from one node to another node in a reliable way. So we can use controllers attached to these nodes just in order to disable connections that are failing or corrupt. So for instance, here, these green controllers could exchange some information and say, okay, since this node failed, so there may have been some uncontrollable action here that made this node KO. So these controllers would get the information and then disable these connections so that you get this path from this node to this node that avoids these failing nodes. So having these controllers here means that you add some little programs on each node, and these little programs may find some routing of information that avoids failing nodes. Okay, so we had hope that the Zielonka setting would give us more decidability than the Pnolly-Rosner setting. Why? Because Pnolly-Rosner, as I said, it really has straightforward a partial information game flavor. So you feel that partial information is there, so you know that you can't do much for getting decidability. In the Zielonka setting, the hope was that might be decidable in general because controllers have as much information as possible. So they have all the causal past. You can't transfer more information than the causal past. And there are some decidability results for restricted Zielonka automata. There is another decidability result for the case where process communication is acyclic, still the complexity is tau and complete. So there are all these results. There's also a connection between control for Zielonka automata and so-called Petri games. That is something that was introduced by Finpa and Olderock. So there was a certain development here around the Zielonka setting, but unfortunately, it turned out this year, or maybe last year even, at the end of last year, but it's on archive. It turned out that unfortunately controller synthesis in the Zielonka setting is undecidable. So this means that although we have this setting where we can construct automata, we cannot solve games, and there are only partial decidability results, which is, I must admit, quite disappointing. So what can we do? So what can we do in this situation? So what we did is to turn to other models to see, to understand maybe simpler models where we have less information even, but where the interaction between processes is more loose than the Zielonka model, and more symmetric than in the Brunelian-Rossner setting. So we started to look at log sharing systems. So this is the last part of the talk. So log sharing is very classical in distributed computing. So you have this well-known example of dynamic philosophers where they communicate, or they cooperate by taking logs on forks. So they have resources here, and you take a resource. So this means that the other guy is not able to take the resource. You need to release it in order to let the other guy to acquire it again. And here the question that people are interested, very often interested in, the property they consider, is deadlock avoidance. Okay, so this is an example with two processes. So in general, we have a finite set of finite state processes, and they have local actions or acquire locks and release locks. So for instance, acquire lock 1, acquire 2, release 1, release 2, and so on and so forth. So there's a pool of locks, and there are these acquire release operations. Locks do not have colors, so there's no way to transfer information between processes via locks, only by owning them and acquiring and releasing. Deadlock means that no process can do a transition. So that means a global deadlock. And the deadlock avoidance problem is, given a log sharing system, decide if processes can have local strategies that avoid global deadlocks. Okay, that's the deadlock avoidance problem. So here in the example, you have a deadlock. So if process P acquires lock 1, process Q acquires lock 2, then you are in a deadlock because each of them wants to have the other deadlock, but it's not yet available. So remember that strategies need to be here local. So they are local. A process can take decisions only according to its local path, to its local executions. There are no communications, so no causal memory, nothing of the kind. And yeah, I forgot to write it on the slides, but as in the Zielonka setting, we have controllable and uncontrollable actions. So it's the same setting with two kinds of actions, and controllers cannot disable uncontrollable actions. So this is the model. It's asynchronous. There's no information exchange, and the cooperation between processes is very loose. It's based on locks. Okay, so there's nothing very fancy. Now, it turns out that these systems allow to do distributed synthesis. In the case of, so with the following restriction, so that we call two-lock systems. So in the two-lock system, each process uses only 2 locks, but the number of locks overall is arbitrary. So there's no restriction, but it's like in dynamic philosophers, every process can use only 2 locks because it has access only to 2 resources. And the main idea is here that if you look to that if you use only 2 locks, is that you can summarize local runs of processes through patterns. So I will tell you on the next slide what a pattern is. But the main idea is that these patterns suffice to do the following. So if you give a pattern for each local run, then you can determine if these runs can be scheduled into a global run without remembering the entire run, just the patterns which are finite. So here you have the 4 types of patterns. So if you take this run, So for instance, states 1 and 5, these are states where the process does not own any locks, so no locks. On the other hand, state 2 is a state where the process owns one lock, and the last action on locks was this one, acquire this lock. On the contrary, state 4 is a state where the process owns only one lock 2 here, but the last action was not an operation on this lock, it was this release 1. And finally, you have state 3 here, where the process owns 2 locks. So this is a finite information that we recall on each local run. And as I said, it turns out that these patterns suffice to know whether we can find a schedule of all the runs of all processes corresponding to these patterns into a global run. So for instance, in this example, you can schedule first process P, because it releases all locks at the end, and then process Q. Yeah, so there are some rules of this kind. So this run, for instance, cannot be scheduled. So in this run, you see actually that you have here, so you have at this state, the pattern acquire 2, but the last action was release 1, and here the other way around, and this gives you a cycle actually. So the idea is that if you give a pattern for each local run, you can schedule all this into a global run if and only if at the end no lock is held by 2 different processes, and in addition there's no cycle with respect to these patterns acquire a lock, release the other one. So it's a property on a graph of locks. So you have a directed graph on locks, and you exclude some cycles on this graph. Okay. And with so with this, we showed that deadlock avoidance for 2 lock systems is actually complete for the second level of the polynomial time hierarchy. So it suffices to in order to know whether some strategy exists, distributed strategy to avoid deadlock. It suffices to guess a set of possible patterns, one for each process. So these are the local strategies. Then we can check in polynomial time if these local strategies are feasible individually on each process. And then we have another check in co-NP if these local strategies can yield a deadlock. So this is a bit as one could expect, that this check in co-NP involves some cycle in a graph over locks, but I mean technically it's a bit complicated. What is interesting is that if we assume that we are interested in special strategies for processes that are locally live, so locally live means that strategies cannot block on their own. So we can have blocking only because of locks. In this case, deadlock avoidance for 2 lock systems is even in NP, which is very good news because I mean, we have not only this ability, but with a very reasonable complexity. Remember that Pliny-Rosner or Zielonka acyclic was tower n complete. Okay, so here it's NP. Yeah, so the last result I want to mention is that I mean, 2 locks, you might say, okay, it's not very fancy, but there's this drinking philosophers problem. So where philosophers need to use resources in order to make a cocktails. So this falls under the category of nested lock systems. So here processes can acquire and release an arbitrary number of locks, but in a stack-like order, so in nested order, which is a restriction that is quite common in programming. And here, deadlock avoidance for nested lock systems is NX p-time complete, which is also quite nice. Okay, so my last slide here is just a caveat that if you impose no restriction on lock sharing systems, again, you get undecidability. So if you have no restriction, you'll even get it for 3 processes and fixed number of locks. I mean, currently we have 4 locks. So why that? Because you can use this here, for instance, you use here 3 locks. so T0 and 1 between two processes in order to communicate one bit. So this is a gadget that allows to communicate either bit 0 between P and C or bit 1. Yeah, so if you look at this example, I want to do it here, so you can see that these gadgets allow only to do in lockstep manner. So process C releases lock 0, process P takes it, then it releases lock T, that one acquires lock T, and so on and so forth, and you get a communication. That's for one bit, and then you can do it so for sequences of bits, and you use 3 processes to simulate, for instance, your favorite unstable problem, like for instance PCP. Okay, so to conclude, I try to give you a brief overview about some possible instantiations, distributed instantiations of church synthesis problem. So the first model was the Pneulier-Rossner model, the most well-known, which gave this bad reputation to distributed synthesis. So there you have synchronous communication, no exchange of information, and only pipelines are decidable. In the Zielonka model, we have asynchronous rendezvous with full information exchange. So processes can exchange their causal past. And here, acyclic architectures are decidable, which is quite nice, but complexity is still very high, or incomplete. And finally, I showed you a model, a distributed model, which is quite nice. So it's, I mean, it's widely used. Let's put it like this. It's not very expensive in terms of exchange of information because there's not much of exchange of information. Still, it's very useful. And here we were able to show that if every process uses at most 2 locks, or if locks are used in nested fashion, then we are decidable with low complexity. Okay, so that's it.
Okay.
So if you have any questions.
Thank you. So we have time for questions. Let me see, anybody in Paris, anybody in Ithaca? Anybody on Zoom? If not, I will kick off with the first question, Anca. First of all, thank you for a fabulous talk. That was really wonderful. Sometimes I think we should show this recording to invited speakers to say, this is how an invited talk should be given.
That's so kind.
So in the distributed systems community, so I'm specifically thinking about people who go to PodC and places like that, there was a lot of work about impossibility results of various kinds.
Yeah.
In particular, a number of those impossibility results involved not using graphs, but simplicial complexes to study more and using homological arguments to prove this. And I'm wondering if there's any relationship between that line of work and what you are doing with the undecidability of various synthesis problems.
That's a very good question. I would like to give you a good answer. So I remember when listening to Maurice Herrlich that I was wondering whether his methods could be helpful to show decidability or undecidability for distributed synthesis in the Zielonka framework. So in the meantime, we have the negative answer, but I should say that there are some links. So there were some results by Jérémy Chalopin, on 2 conjectures of Tyagarajan. So let me say it like this. So it's about event structures and about monadic second order logic over event structures. So now this is exactly the point where we were hoping actually to get decidability of synthesis in the Zielonka model, because for sequential systems, synthesis amounts to have decidability of monadic second order logic over trees of the trees are unfoldings of finite set systems. And event structures, these are unfoldings of Zielonka automata. So there was some hope to understand better these event structures related to Zielonka automata. But still, so there are negative results of Chalopin and Kepoy. so they disproved some conjectures of Tyagarajan. So there was one conjecture saying, for instance, that MSO could be decidable over event structures of Sri Lanka automata where processes do not miss too much knowledge, too much communication from other processes. So something about so at every event, the co of the event, so the number of events in parallel to this event should be uniformly bounded. Okay, and so there are some results in this direction, but mostly negative. So maybe, yeah, it could be interesting to look more at this. But the proofs of Chalopin and Kepoy, they use complexes as well. So they use quite sophisticated graphs.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So sorry. So this was a very long answer, but I mean there's some story behind it.
Yeah, good. So I believe there's a question from Paris with Barbara Koenig. Please go ahead.
Yes. So first, thanks a lot for the nice talk. I have a very basic question about this Kunoe-Rosen model. Can you maybe go back to the slide, one of the first slides where you introduced it? Because my question is, it sounded to me like the specifications of the components are local. So I don't see so much what is the problem, but maybe I misread this somehow.
Yeah. No. You got it right. So I put here local specifications. That's true. So it's where was it?
I thought that there must be some kind of global specification.
Yeah. But the global specification is immediately undecidable. So actually, these local specifications, they are. Do you see still my screen? Yeah. This local specification that was considered by Madhusudan Tyagarajan. So Pnelli and Osner, they show undecidability even for just two nodes that do not communicate at all. And the specification is indeed, as you say, a global specification, but that's for, I mean, it's absolutely clear that this is undecidable. So this in this paper, Madhusudan and Tyagarajan, they show that even with local specification, the problem is undecidable, and that's more elaborate.
Okay, I understand.
Because that's more interesting than having a global specification. I mean, in a distributed setting, it's much more interesting to have local specifications. Much more natural.
But why is it then not possible to solve all the local specifications separately, as in the non-distributed case, and then put everything together?
Because it's like asking why isn't it possible to compute a centralized controller and to distribute it afterwards? Because it doesn't work. This does not work. So that's, I mean, there are other undecidability questions in this sense that show that you. So, for instance, if I give you even in the Sri Lanka setting, if I give you a regular language which is not necessarily commutation closed, and I ask, is there some commutation closed language which is included in that and which is non-empty, some with some restriction, that is an undecidable problem as well.
Okay.
So you can't just go for the centralized controller and distribute it afterwards. It doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So in the interest of time, we'd like to move on to the next talk. Let's thank Anca again for an absolutely fabulous invited talk. Thank you.